All right, fellow brothers and sisters, knuckleheads galore. Welcome. Hayden, welcome. Um, this is the Ace Theological Hootenanny. We are going to take up the subject of. Hang on a second.
Sorry. That was me.
Oh, it was you echoing?
Yeah, I accidentally called it up. Sorry.
All right, let's see. Hang on a second while I do some production. Let's see. There we go. I wanted to send the ticker tape across. Oh, yeah. So we're going to take up the subject of the pagan origins of the Christian hell. We went through a couple hours worth earlier today, part 1 and part 2, and now we'll spend another hour or two on reading it. At the moment, you're here with Lawrence and Justin. They might bail on me, but that's okay.
Depends.
What?
Depends.
That's a diaper you wear if you're having bowel problems.
Oh yeah? Well, if maybe you want to see his other recent video, which was "Does God wear diapers?" That was his second most recent video, believe it or not.
Oh my.
Yeah.
Oh look, Chris found games people play. Oh, probably is a public reading of it, or maybe a public discussion. Thank you for doing that, Chris.
Chris needs to get a picture. I don't know who he is.
Oh yeah. So earlier we started this this book. This book was started in 1855, and then he made a revised edition and another revised edition. Finally, the final thing came out in 1871. So that's plenty of time. 1855 was before the Civil War. So we can clearly say this guy was from the cowboy days. And if you read the essay, just notice the grammar, just the structure of the sentence. These guys were smarter than we are today. I mean, we think we're all smart and, we can barely type in 200 character message in our side chat, right? But this guy had complex sentences, and I suspect everybody from the 1800s was smarter than we are today, because today we've been polluted by government school systems. Mm-hmm. They have a bad track record, don't you know? They're not interested in creating intelligent thinkers and statesmen and scientists and inventors. They're just interested in creating more cannon fodder for the war. Anyway, so when we were reading this earlier, here's what I remember that we covered. Throughout the Old Testament, throughout the whole Old Testament, oh man, you just can't find anything about eternal conscious punishment. Now, the Christians who believe in eternal conscious punishment, they might come up with an inference or a conjecture, but there's just no clear passages from the Garden of Eden all the way through to Malachi about eternal conscious punishment. And then also in the earlier readings, he pointed out the many times that the Bible, when it talks about the law to Israel, about whether or not they do or do not do the law, the punishment was always temporal, and it was always on the earth. You will, on the earth, have a short life or a long life, or you will have a body full of boils and scabs, or your crops will be full of mush and mold. But there was nothing about, if you are disobedient to the law, you will burn endlessly in hell. There was no talk like that at all. Anyway, so let's see what else. Do you remember anything, Lawrence or Justin, about the earlier essay?
I liked when he said that it's not in the mind of God.
Right, to punish somebody in hell endlessly.
Right. And he
Mhm.
was referencing it to the fact that, whenever you looked at all these passages of the sinner of sinners, in the Old Testament, whatever sinners of sinners you could find, instead of talking about them burning endlessly, it was their recompense was death, or, in its mentioning details that would seem irrelevant if they're going to burn endlessly, like them getting their house together.
Right. You remember something, Lawrence? You have to turn your mic on to talk.
Say it again.
You remember anything from the two earlier shows about this?
No, I was in and out working today, so I
All
missed
right,
a
that
lot
makes
of it.
sense.
Yeah.
Another thing I remember is that this guy, Brother Thomas Thayer, who wrote in 1871 this little book, he went to great lengths to show that Moses was raised by the Pharaoh's daughter. The Pharaoh's daughter found little baby Moses floating in the creek, and she was charmed by the little baby, and so she raised him, and he had royalty. His family was royalty because she was the Pharaoh's daughter, and so of course he knew all about the Egyptian version of endless conscious torment in hell. And if he knew all about the Egyptian version of hell, that's why we can say it has pagan origins. How interesting, this brother Thayer says, how interesting that he writes the law, and the book of Genesis and all these, Old Testament passages, and there's no mention of a endless punishment in hell. All the punishment is just temporal, and it's of the earth, and at the worst, it's just death. But he could have brought in the pagan idea of hell, but he did not. And then I think it was either me reading ahead of schedule or the last two episodes. He goes to lengths to show that that between Malachi, the very last book in the Old Testament, between Malachi and the New Testament showing up, there's 400 years when Israel did not have a prophet. And they were doing some awful naughty things, Israel, right? They had turned away from their God. And so Brother Thayer suggests that's when the Pharisees started bringing in the pagan origins of the pagan version of hell into the picture. And we know that the rich man and Lazarus was in the Pharisaical literature before Jesus ever used the metaphor of the rich man and Lazarus. And so between Malachi and the New Testament showing up, there's 400 years of not very much attention paid by Israel to Yahweh. So that would be a fine time to bring in, an apostasy, shall we say. Anyway, that's what I remember from the reading so far. And we're on chapter 3. And now we're going to get down and dirty. Instead of looking at the Old Testament specifically, we'll get down and dirty with endless punishment of heathen origin. And I think back in the cowboy days, heathen was the equivalent of our modern day word pagan. So I use the word pagan in the subject line of this episode, and he uses the word heathen. Okay, on your mark, get set, go. In the previous chapters, what? You mean you're not going to start over just for me? No, we're not going to start over just for you. Go back and listen to the other two episodes that we made today. It's called part 1 and part 2, and now we're on part 3. In the previous chapters, we have followed our subject through the patriarchal and law periods down to the close of the Old Testament. And the inquiry has satisfactorily shown, we trust, that the doctrine of endless punishment is nowhere to be found in the sacred scriptures of the Jews. But we know that the heathen world during a large portion of this period was in possession of the doctrine and fully believed it. It is pertinent to our subject, therefore, to inquire into their belief and to endeavor to ascertain from what source they obtained it. It may be, too, that the examination will discover to us the source of some of our modern doctrines on the subject. At any rate, it will show that the superstitions of the past and the present of pagans and Christians are not very wide apart. Woo-wee. Do I have to read that to you again? Even though it was perfect English, and even though it was 1800s English, I think you got it. The doctrine of the pagans and the Christians are not very far apart. Okay, descriptions of the heathen hell. Among the ancient pagans, the belief in hell of some sort was very general, if not universal. It was known by various names as Orcus, Erebus, Tartarus, and Infernus or Inferna, whence our expression infernal regions, etc. The views current respecting it were different at different periods and among different nations, according to the degree of civilization and the genius of the people. What I shall offer on this point will have respect mostly to the Greeks and the Romans and the Egyptians. Okay? Say amen if you are following along right now. Number one, its location.
Amen.
Yes, amen. Its location. It was supposed to be as far below the earth or as deep down in it as the heavens are above. Hesiodod, the Greek poet who lived 850 years BC, is very precise in his statement and says a mass of iron would be 9 days falling from heaven to earth and 9 more days falling from earth to hell. Oh my God. So says Apollodorus and Virgil and others. Number two, the inhabitants of hell. Some idea of the natives of the country may be gathered from the following description taken from Aeneid of Virgil. Quote, at hell's dread mouth, 1,000 monsters wait. Oh, yikes. Hey, Hayden, are you listening? At hell's dread mouth, 1,000 monsters wait. I don't want to hear anymore. I'm scared. Grief weeps. What? Grief weeps and vengeance bellows in the gate. Base want and low fear and famine's lawless rage and pale disease and slow repining age. Fierce formidable fiends, the portals keep with pain, toil, death, and death's half-brother, sleep. Their joys embittered by remorse appear. The daughters of guilt here storms destructive war. Mad discord there her stanky tresses tore. Here stretched in iron beds the furies roar, and closed by Lerna's hissing monster stands. Briareus, dreadful with 100 hands, there stern Chiron raged, and all around fierce harpies scream, and desire gorgons found. Does that scare you? It scares me. The gate of hell was guarded by a dog, Servius. What? I know a Servius. Some guy on the YouTube community. His name is Servius. I think brother, what's his name? Doubting Thomas knows him. And who else is in here? Lord Redfang knows Servius. Maybe that's the reference here. The gate of hell was guarded by the dog Cerberus of 3 heads, Hesiod, says 50, who prevented all egress from the infernal regions. Once in, there was no escape. What? This sounds exactly like Eric. Because Eric has told me on a number of occasions, once you go into the lake of fire, there's no getting out. Holy smoke. Once in, there is no escape. Somebody get the message to Eric that somebody out there in the mythological world agrees with him.
Can he ever describe the purpose of the lake of fire, since you can never get out?
I guess it's just vengeance of God, you know.
Just
God
an
is
angry
eternally
God.
pissed off.
Yeah.
Once in, there is no escape. To make it still more sure, the horrid prison of hell was surrounded by a river of fire called Phlegethon, within which was another security in the shape of a triple wall. Hence, Virgil says, "Here rolls the roaring flame tide of hell, and thundering rocks the fiery torrents swell." Oh, God. Do you want to be a Christian?
Not anymore.
Man. Oh, my God. Okay. Of the punishments, number 3 of the punishments. Virgil gives us a brief account of these in the book already quoted from. Quote, now wild shouts and wailings dire, and shrieking infants swell the dreadful choir. Here sits in bloody robes the fury fell, by night and day to watch the gates of hell. Here you begin terrific groans to hear, and sounding lashes rise upon the ear. On every side the damned their fretters great, and curse mid clanking chains their wretched fate. Does this make you want to be a Christian, boys and girls? To avoid the lake of fire and the hell of Eric's making? Lord have mercy. Okay, a few examples of individual torments will better illustrate the subject and reveal at the same time how inherent in them is the idea of perpetual duration. Exeon, for a certain monstrous sin, is bound to a wheel of fire, which is ever in continual motion in swift revolution of torment. Tantalus, for having attempted to deceive some of the gods who visited him by placing roasted human flesh before them, was tortured with endless hunger and thirst. Hey, Hayden, are you listening? Does this sound like anything you know? Jill, are you listening? He was placed in a lake up to his chin in water. He was placed in a lake up to his chin in the water, and over his head bent the branches of a tree loaded with the most delicious and inviting fruit. Agonizing with hunger and thirst, he stretched out his hand to seize the fruit, when it was instantly withdrawn just above his reach. He stooped to drink the cooling waters, and immediately they stank away, and no drop touched his lips, but they rose again to his chin when he rose. Wow. From this comes our word tantalize. Okay, the 50 daughters of Danaus, or rather 49, for murdering their husbands in the night of marriage, were condemned to fill a leaky tub with water drawn from a deep well with a sieve. You know what a sieve is? A sieve has a lot of leaks in it, right? Of course, there was no end to such a task. Sisyphus was condemned to roll a huge stone to the summit of a high hill in hell, but always just before he reached the top, his strength failed, and it rushed down again to the bottom of the steep, and compelled him to begin his labors again, always to end in the same way. Another miserable wretch had a mighty rock suspended over his head, threatening every instant to fall and crush him. Tityrus, for his crimes, was chained to a rock, while a vulture fed upon his heart and entrails, which were ever renewed as fast as devoured. Oh my God. Oh my God. This sounds like the Christians.
Sadly,
Such
it does.
love. Such love. These examples are sufficient to illustrate the doctrines and teachings of the heathen respecting future punishments, and they show more graphically than any words could how essential to their completeness is the element of perpetuity, of endlessness. There can be no doubt in respect to their belief in the torments of the wicked after death, or of their opinion respecting the duration of them. The fact then being established that the dogma is thoroughly heathen, pagan in its character and development. This question presents itself: where did the heathen get it? Whence came these fables respecting the infernal regions? The next section will answer this inquiry. Okay. Section number 2. The pagan heathens invented the doctrine of endless punishment shown by their own confessions. Anyone at all familiar with the writings of the ancient Greeks or Romans cannot fail to note how often it is admitted by them that the national religions were the invention of the legislature and the priest. Holy smoke. Let's underline this one. Often it was invented by the legislature and the priest. This does not speak well of the whole matter. If it's the government boys inventing the doctrine of hell, you can trust the government, right? Yeah, roll up your sleeve. For the purpose of governing and restraining the common people. They were the inventions of the legislature and the priest for the purpose of governing and restraining the common people. Hence, all the early lawgivers claimed to have communications with the gods who aided them in the preparation of their codes. Somebody should tell JG and Eric and Jill and brother, so-called brother Timothy, and who else? Beckel, because they seem to have the attitude that if you take away this eternal punishment, everybody will start sinning and robbing banks and all chaos will break loose. Well, that's just what the legislatures and the priests think. Hence, all the early lawgivers claimed to have communications with the gods who aided them in the presentation of their codes. Zoroaster claimed to have received his laws from a divine source. Lycurgus obtained his from Apollo. Minos of Crete from Jupiter. Numar of Rome from Egeria. Zalacus from Minervar, etc. The subject of this sacred fraud was to impress the minds of the multitude with religious awe and command a more ready obedience on their part. Wow, sir. Well, what do we got here? It's worth a highlighting at least. And command a more ready obedience on their part. Hence, Augustine says in his City of God book, quote unquote, City of God, this seems to have been done on no other account, but as it was the business of princes, out of their wisdom and civil prudence, to deceive the people in their own religion. Princes, under the name of religion, persuaded the people to believe those things true, which they themselves knew to be idle fables. By this means, for their own ease in government, tying them more closely to a civil society. And the reference is book 4, page 32, I guess. Of course, in order to secure obedience, they were obliged to invent divine punishment for the disobedient of what they asserted to be divine laws. Hence, Brother Bishop Walberton says, quote, they enforced the belief of a future state of rewards and punishment by every sort of contrivance, end quote. And speaking of the addition of metapsychosis, or the transmigration of souls, he says, quote, this was an ingenious solution invented by the Egyptian lawgivers, to remove all doubt concerning the moral attributes of God. Oh God, man, this does not speak well of the whole subject. Okay. Egypt has been called the mother of superstitions. Well, that's interesting. And remember, this was written in the cowboy days. Egypt has been called the mother of superstitions, and her whole religious history shows the property of the appellation. Greeks and Romans, lawgivers and philosophers acknowledged their indebtedness to her in this respect. Philosophers? Let's highlight that. Somebody needs to go tell JG, because he seems to be right on point with these knuckleheads, making sure that philosophy has within it a code of moral ethics. And Ace, if you don't give us your moral ethics, you must be condemned. Egypt has been called the mother of superstitions, and her whole religious history shows the propriety of the appellation. Greeks and Roman lawgivers and philosophers acknowledge their indebtedness to her in this respect and freely credit her with the original invention of fables and terrors of the invisible world, though it must be allowed that they have improved somewhat upon the hints given and shown a wonderful inventive faculty of their own. Dr. Good has a curious passage on the subject at hand in his book of Nature, which I must be permitted to introduce here. Quote, it was believed in most countries, he says, that this hell, Hades, or invisible world is divided into two very distinct and opposite regions. I was told this just recently by Eric, I think it was, or maybe it was Jill. Hades, or the invisible world, is divided into two distinct and opposite regions by a broad and impassable gulf. That the one is a seat of happiness, a paradise, or Elysium, and the other a seat of misery, or Gehenna, or Tartarus, and that there is a supreme magistrate and an impartial tribunal belonging to the infernal shades, before which the ghost must appear, and by which they are sentenced to the one or the other according to the deeds done in the body. Egypt is said to have been the inventress of this important and valuable part of the tradition, and undoubtedly it is to be found in the earliest records of Egyptian history. But from the wonderful conformity of its outlines to the parallel doctrines of scriptures, it is probable that it has a still higher origin, and that is constituted a part of the patriarchal creed, retained in a few channels, though forgotten or obliterated in others, and consequently that it was a divine communication in a very early age. And the reference number is 7. probably listed at the end of this chapter, number 7. The last assertion is certainly a singular statement for a man of Dr. Good's learning and judgment. For first, it does not conform at all to the doctrine of the Scriptures in regard to rewards and punishment, as our inquiry has fully shown. And second, the patriarchal creed makes no mention of it, as far as we know, and if made part of an earlier revelation, afterwards lost, it is reasonable to suppose that it would have been renewed again in the revelation to the law of Moses. Besides, if the Egyptians obtained it from any of the patriarchs, it must have been from Jacob or his descendants after they went down into Egypt. It must have been a current doctrine, therefore, among the Israelites, and regarded by them as of divine authority. But this conclusion is shut off by the fact that Moses, though divinely commissioned as their teacher, rejects it from his law and shows his unbelief and contempt for it by a studied and unbroken silence. Curious indeed, if Dr. Good's supposition is correct, we find the doctrine in full bloom with the Egyptians, but not a trace of it among the early Hebrews. But singularly enough, when in after ages the Jews had become corrupted and had departed from the law of Moses, we find the doctrine among them. And what is very noteworthy is that, as the next chapter will show, its first appearance is in the apocryphal books written by Egyptian Jews. Holy smoke! Is this ever an indictment? Let's highlight that. What is very noteworthy, as the next chapter will show, is its first appearance, the appearance of the doctrine of eternal conscious torment in hell, made its first appearance in the apocryphal books written by Egyptian Jews, so that the facts happen to be very opposite of Dr. Good's theory. Instead of the Egyptians borrowing it from the Jews borrowed it from the Egyptians. In attempting to set out the Egyptian notions on the subject, it is difficult to choose between the conflicting accounts of the Greek writers, Herodias, Diosdorus, Sycolcus, Plutarch, etc., as well as of the modern interpreters of the monumental hieroglyphics. Still, with regard to the main question, they are tolerably well agreed, though there is a great diversity of opinion in respect to the details. It is plain enough from their united testimony that the whole matter of judgment after death, the rewards of a good life, and the punishments of a bad life, with all the formal solemnities of trial and condemnation, originated and was perfected among the Egyptians, according to the peculiar character of their mythology. Okay, let's highlight that. From them it was borrowed by the Greeks, who made such changes and additions as fitted the system to the genius and circumstances of that people. It would seem that each district of Egypt had what was called its sacred lake, beyond which the tombs and the buried places of the dead, Archusia, the lake near Memphis, was the model, probably for the rest, and appears to have furnished a general name for them. When anyone died, it was the duty of his relations, according to Diodorus, to notify the 42 judges or assessors whose office it was to decide upon the character of the deceased and then appoint the day for the funeral ceremonies and burial. When the day came, the body of the dead was carried in procession to the shore of the lake, from which it could not be removed until after the judgment. 42 judges, having been summoned, were in waiting at the place of embarkation to receive the body and enter the trial. It was then lawful for any person who thought proper to bring charges against the deceased, and if it was proved that he had led an evil life, the judges condemned him for his wickedness and refused him the privilege of burial, which was regarded as one of the greatest possible calamities. But if those accusing the dead failed to establish their accusations, they were subjected to the heaviest penalties. If those accusing the dead failed to establish their accusations, they were subjected to the heaviest penalties. If there was no accuser, or the charges were disproved, then his relations were allowed to pronounce the custom eulogy, praising his piety and goodness, celebrating his virtues, and declaring the excellent life which he had lived. This was followed by a prayer supplicating the gods of the underworld to receive him into the society of the blessed. Then came the acclamations of the multitude assembled on the occasion, who united in extolling the character of the dead and rejoicing that he was now going to join the virtuous in the regions of Amente or Hades. This over, the body was placed in a funeral boat under the direction of Horus, the ferryman of the dead, and borne across the lake to its place of sepulture. This done, the ceremonies of the occasion closed. The bodies of those who had been refused burial were carried back by the family and the coffins set up against the hall of the house. The spirit could not be at rest until the body was buried. The duration of this punishment was limited, says Wilkinson, according to the extent of the crimes of which the accused had been guilty. When the devotion of friends, aided by liberal donations in the service of religion, and the influential prayers of priests had sufficiently softened the otherwise inexorable nature of the gods, the period of this state of purgatory was doubtless shortened. Reference number 8. Besides this judgment on earth, it appears that there was another after the dead entered the regions of Amente or Hades. For what reason, we cannot say, except the judges of the invisible world were a kind of superior court who examined the case anew with a view of correcting any errors of the previous trial. Sir JG, hey, there's a JG. Let's highlight that in honor of our own beloved little JG. Sir J.G. Wilkinson informs us that the judgment scenes found in the tombs and on the papyri sometimes represent the deceased conducted by Horus to the region of Amente Cerberus, is present as the guardian of the gates, near which the scales of justice were erected. Anubis, the director of the weight, having placed a vase representing the good actions or the heart of the deceased in one scale, and the figure or the emblem of truth in the other, proceeded to ascertain his claims for admission. If, on being weighed, he is found wanting, he is released, and Osiris, the judge of the dead, inclining the sepulchre in token of condemnation, pronounces judgment upon him and condemns his soul to return to earth under the form of a pig or some other unclean animal. Placed in a boat, it is removed. under the charge of 2 monkeys from the precincts of Amende, all communication with which is figuratively cut off by a man who hews away the earth with an axe after his passage, and the commencement of a new term of life is indicated by the monkeys, the emblems of Thoth as time. Well, we are getting a dose of superstition here, I say. But if, when the sums of his deeds have been recorded, his virtues so far predominate as to entitle him to admission into the mansions of the blessed, Horace introduces him to Osiris. It is with this judgment, at the point where the condemned soul is sent back again to the earth in the form of an animal, that the doctrine of transmigration seems to connect itself. According to Herodotus, the Egyptians believed the soul would pass from one body to another till it had performed the circuit of all animals, terrestrial, marine, and birds of the air, when it again takes up its abode in the human body. God, these guys are complicated. This transmigration, it was supposed, would fill up a period of 3,000 years. Good golly, Miss Molly. Are you guys following this?
Apparently.
Doesn't it sound like Christianity?
It sounds even more merciful than Christianity.
3,000 years. There was a great diversity of opinion in regard to the particulars of this curious arrangement, but the leading idea appears to have been punishment of the wicked for the wicked only, according to some authorities who were subject to it. The good and pious being received immediately on the burial of the body into rest, and returning to the good being whence they emanated. This sounds like it's worthy of quoting again, so let's highlight it. And it would seem, according to Wilkinson, that it was only the ordinarily wicked, not the very worst, who were condemned to this purgatory. He thinks that the monuments show that the souls which underwent transmigration were those of men whose sins were of sufficiently moderate kind to admit of that purification, the unpardonable sinner being condemned to eternal fire, by which he means endless fire. They had an unpardonable sin in their mythology. Cool. These records of the ancient Greeks, confirmed by the monuments, as illustrated by modern scholars, open to us the origin of the doctrines of judgment after death, and the future endless rewards and punishments for the good deeds or evil deeds of this life. From the Egyptians, it passed with suitable modifications to the Greeks and the Romans. That's worthy of highlighting in yellow, so let's do it. Diodorus himself clearly shows that the fables of the Archerisian lake, or Hecate, Cerberus, Charon, and the Styx have their origin in these Egyptian ceremonies and doctrines. And Professor Stewart, in a note to Greppo's essays on the hieroglyphics, accepts the statement of Spinato that the Amente of the Egyptians originated the classical fables of Hades and Tartarus, Charon, Pluto, the judges of hell, the dog Cerberus, and Crimeas, harpies, gorgons, furies, and other unnatural and horrible things with which the Greeks and the Roman people, their fatalistic hell. People, their fatalistic hell. That means they put a lot of people there. Okay, Greek mythology. Let's highlight this just for easy eye-catching reading there. Okay. It is curious to note the exactness of the copy in many particulars. The Egyptian Archezuia gives us the Greek Archeon and perhaps Styx. The Egyptian Tartar, significant of the lamentations of relatives over the dead, refuse burial on account of their wicked lives, furnishes the Greek Tartarus, where the wicked are punished. The funeral boat across the lake, the ferryman, and the gold piece in the mouth of the dead gives rise to Charon, his boat, and fee. And the passage across the Styx into Hades. The cemetery beyond the lake, surrounded by trees, called by the Egyptians Elysaut or Elysios, is the original of the Greek Elysian fields, the abode of the blessed. The three infernal judges, Minos, Arcas, Radamanus, are borrowed from the Egyptian judges of the dead. And the heads of animals symbolize these judges, mistaken by the Greeks, are changed into monsters, gorgon, harpies, and furies, etc. But as I have remarked, though the Greeks borrowed, they altered and improved. And true to that individualism, which was so marked by the characteristic of that people, they are not satisfied with the Egyptian method of generalizing, respecting the punishments of the wicked, but begin specifying particular sinners and particular kinds of punishment adapted to particular offenses. Hence the fables of Zion, Tantalus, Tityrus, whose torments in the infernal regions are mentioned in the beginning of this chapter. Everything must be sharp, pointed, and dramatic to suit the lively genius of the Greek, and the terrors of the invisible world must be presented in a way to strike the imagination in the most powerful manner and produce some direct results on the individual and on society. The whole thing is designed for effect, to influence the multitude, to restrain their passions, and to aid the magistrate and ruler in keeping them subject to authority. When you know it here, baby, let's highlight that. It is the invention of priests and lawmakers who take this as the easiest method of governing the people. They claim the divine right to govern. They claim the right divine to govern. They claim that their laws originate with the gods, as we have shown, and that therefore the gods will visit on all offenders the terrors and tortures of the damned. Man. Of the damned. Hence, through the joint cunning of priests and legislature, of church and state, mutually supporting each other, we have all the stupendous frauds and falsehoods respecting the invisible world. I hope you guys are listening. Say amen in the side chat if you're catching on here and enjoying this reading. If you want to read it yourself, you can hop over to down here at the show notes. I put a link in for you in the show notes. And somebody can put a link in the side chat there. Okay. But without further remarks of my own, I will introduce the testimony of the heathen pagans themselves on this point, and those best informed among them, who will tell their own story in their own way. One preliminary observation, however, partly made already, I wish to repeat, and I desire the reader to have it always in mind, okay? The rulers and magistrates and prince or priests invent these terrors to keep the masses in subjection. The people religiously believe in them, while the inventors, of course, and the educated class and the priests and the philosophers, though they teach them to the multitude, have themselves no manner of faith in them. The rulers don't believe this bullshit. Number one, Polybius, the historian, says, since the multitude is ever fickle, full of lawless desires, irrational passions, and violence, there is no other way to keep them in order but by fear and terror of the invisible world, on which account our ancestors seem to me to have acted judiciously when they contrived to bring the popular beliefs, these notions of the gods, and the infernal regions. Number two, Dionysus treats the whole matter as useful, but not as true. Antiquities, Roman Antiquities, Book B. Number three, Levi, the celebrated historian, speaks of it in the same spirit, and he praises the wisdom of Numa, because he invented the fear of the gods as a most efficacious means of governing an ignorant and barbarous populace. Number four, Strabo, the geographer, says the multitude are restrained. The multitude are restrained from vice by the punishment of the gods, and are said to inflict that the punishment of the gods are said to inflict upon offenders, and by those terrors and threatenings which certain dreadful words and monstrous forms imprint on their minds. For it is impossible to govern the crowd of men and all the common rabble by philosophical reasoning and lead them to piety, holiness, and virtue. But this must be done by superstition, or the fear of their gods, by means of fables and wonders, for the thunder and the aegis, the trident and the torches of the Furies, the dragons, etc., are all fables, as is also the ancient theology. These things the legislators use as scarecrows to terrify the childish multitude. Oh, Lord. Item number 5. Timaeus, the Pythagorean, after stating that the doctrine of rewards and punishments after death is necessary to society, proceeds as follows, quote, for as we sometimes cure the body with unwholesome remedies, when such as are most wholesome produce no effect, we restrain those minds with false relations which will not be persuaded by the truth. There is a necessity, therefore, of instilling the dread of those foreign torments. Number 10. Reference number 10. As the soul changes its habitation, that the coward is ignominiously thrusted into the body of a woman, the murderer imprisoned with the form of a savage beast, the vain and inconstant changed into birds, and the slothful and ignorant into fishes. Weird, huh? Plato, in his commentary on Timaeus, fully endorses what he says respecting the fabulous invention of these foreign torments. And Strabo says that, quote, Plato and the Brahmins of India invented fables concerning the future judgment of hell, or Hades. And Chrysippus blames Plato for attempting to deter men from wrong by frightful stories of future punishments. Plato himself is exceedingly inconsistent, sometimes adopting even in his serious discourses, the fable of the poets, and at other times rejecting them as utterly false and giving too frightful views of the invisible world. Sometimes he argues on social grounds that they are necessary to restrain bad men from wickedness and crime, and then again he protests against them on political grounds as intimidating the citizens and making cowards of the soldiers who believe these things, are afraid of death, and do not therefore fight well. But all this shows in what light he regarded them, not as truths, certainly, but as fictions, convenient in some cases, but difficult to manage in others. Lord have mercy. Plutarch, number 7. Plutarch treats the subject in the same way, sometimes arguing for them with great solemnity and earnestness, and on other occasions calling them fabulous stories, tales of mothers and nurses. Okay, number 8. Seneca says, those things which make the infernal regions terrible, the darkness, the prison, the river, a flaming fire, the judgment seat, etc., are all a fable with which the poets amuse themselves, and by them agitate us with vain terrors. Sectus Empiricus calls them poetic fables of hell, and Cicero speaks of them as silly absurdities and fables. Number 9, Aristotle. It has been handed down in mythical form from the earliest times to posterity that there are gods and that the divine deity compasses all nature. All besides this has been added after the mythical style for the purpose of persuading the multitude and for the interest of the laws and the advantage of the state. Let's highlight that because that's a god-awful accusation to say that all this crap happens for the advantage of the state. Okay, and that's from Neander's Church History, item number 11. The question with which this section began, whence came the doctrine of future endless punishment, is now, I trust, answered by a sufficient number of witnesses to settle the matter beyond dispute. The pagan heathens themselves confessed to the invention of the dogma and of all the fabulous stories of the infernal regions. The legislatures and sages, let me highlight that for a second, hang on. The legislatures and sages very frankly state that the whole thing was devised for its supposed utility in governing the gross and ignorant multitude of men and women who cannot be restrained by the precepts of philosophy. Okay, they have not the slightest faith in these things themselves. That's worth highlighting. They don't believe their own bullshit. They do not think them at all necessary to regulate their own lives or keep them in order, but it is for the common people, the coarse rabble, who can only in this way be terrified into good behavior. Man, this is awful. This is an awful accusation, brothers and sisters. We got to terrify them into good behavior. One cannot help noting the resemblance between these wise men and some of our own day who seem so anxious to maintain the doctrine of eternal conscious torment on the ground that it is necessary to restrain men from sin. Wow. Let's highlight that one. One One cannot help help noting the resemblance between these so-called wise men and some of our own day, some Christian boys of our own day, who seem so anxious to maintain that the doctrine, this endless doctrine, endless hell doctrine on the ground that is necessary to restrain men from sin. But unfortunately for this theory, the revelations of history, both pagan and Christian, are all in opposition to it. And then here's the references. Number one, Catholic Catechism, and so forth and so on. You can read it yourself if you get a copy of the PDF. It's in the show notes below. I'm going to race through it so we can save time. You don't need to hear it from me. Chapter 7. Mac the human, you are funny. Chapter 7. The Jews borrowed the doctrine from the pagans. Should we say borrowed or stole it? I guess you can't absolutely steal an idea because the idea still remains with the heathen pagans. Okay. It is allowed. Let's see, how far are we? We're not even halfway done yet. Cool. It is allowed on all hands that the Jews in our Savior's time believed in the doctrine of future endless punishment, that it was a part of the common faith. Of course, as the doctrine is nowhere to be found in the scriptures, the question arises, where did they find it? At the close of the Old Testament scriptures, they did not believe it. At the beginning of the New Testament, they did. The Pharisees, that is. Between these 2 points of time, there was an interval of some 400 years, during which there was no prophet in Israel. Malachi was the last of the Hebrew prophets, and from him to Christ there stretches this waste period of 4 centuries when the Jews were without any divine teacher or revelation from heaven. And all this while they were in constant and close intercourse with the heathen, especially them their Egyptians and the Greeks and the Romans, who held the doctrine in review as part of the national faith. From these, therefore, they must have borrowed it, for it is certain that they could not have obtained it from any inspired source, since none was open to them during this period. And let's highlight the words inspired source. Cool, it already did it. Okay, besides, they were all this time, as one might infer from their previous history, departing further and further from the law and growing more and more corrupt, till at last they had, as the Savior charges upon them, utterly made void the law of God by their traditions. Mark chapter 7, 9, and 13. Mr. Brucker says that after the times of Esdras, Zechariah, Malachi, and the inspired men, the Jews began to forsake the sacred doctrine and turned aside to the dreams of human invention, human ingeniosomia. Though up to this time they had preserved pure Hebrew wisdom received from the fathers. Item number 1. The last part of this statement is perhaps too strongly worded. They did not certainly preserve the wisdom of their ancestors and the sacred doctrine pure till after the times of Malachi and the close of the prophetic period. Their departure from the simplicity of the law dates further back than this, even to the time of the Babylonian captivity. The Oriental philosopher made considerable impressions on the general as well as the speculative mind, and by degrees crumbled down the walls that guarded the sanctuary of the ancient faith. and prepared the way for the general corruption which followed the death of the last prophets. A careful study of the later books of the Old Testament will show this very plainly. Speaking on this point, Guazat has the following quote: the Jews had acquired at Babylon, the Jews had acquired at Babylon a greater number of Oriental notions, and their theological opinions had undergone great change by this intercourse. We find in Ecclesiasticus and the Wisdom of Solomon and the later prophets notions unknown to the Jews before the Babylonian captivity, which are manifestly derived from the Orientals. Thus, God represented under the image of light and the principle of evil under that of darkness. The history of good and bad angels, paradise and hell, are the doctrines of which origin. Let me read that again. Thus, God represented under the image of light and the principle of evil under that of darkness, the history of good and bad angels, paradise and hell, etc., are doctrines of which the origin, at least the positive determination, can only be referred to the Oriental philosophy. Thus, we see that cords which bound them to the authority of Moses and to the law, the written law, and revelations of God had been slowly relaxing for a long time. Of course, when the last prophet had departed and God had withdrawn all special guidance, the growth of corruption among them and conforming to the pagan opinions rapidly increased. This process is easily understood. About 330 years before Christ, Alexander the Great had subjected to his rule the whole of the Western Asia, including Judea, and also the kingdom of Egypt. Soon after he founded Alexandria, which speedily became a great commercial metropolis, he drew into itself multitudes of Jews who were always eager to improve the opportunities of traffic and trade. A few years later, Ptolemy Staucher took Jerusalem and carried off 100,000 of them into Egypt. Here, of course, they were in daily contact with the Egyptians and Greeks and gradually began to adopt their philosophical and religious opinions or to modify their own in harmony with them. To what side soever they turned, says a careful writer, the Jews came in contact with Greeks and Greek philosophy under one modification or another. It was around them and among them, for small bodies of that people were scattered through their own territories as well as through the surrounding provinces. It insinuated itself very slowly at first, but stealing upon them from every quarter and operating from age to age. It mingled at length in all of their views, and by the year 150 before Christ, had wrought a visible change in their notions and habits and thought. Reference number 3. At Alexandria, too, was established that celebrated school of philosophy and theology, which exerted such a corrupting influence on both Jewish and Christian doctrine and teaching. This school, says Enfield, by pretending to teach a sublimer doctrine concerning God and divine things, entice men of different countries and religions, and among the rest, the Jews, to study its mysteries and incorporate them into their own. Hence, under the cloak of symbols, pagan philosophy gradually crept into the Jewish schools, and the Platonic doctrines, mixed first with Pythagorean and afterwards with the Egyptian and Oriental, were blended with the ancient faith in their explanations of the law and their traditions. This corruption, which began in the time of Ptolemy Philadelphicus, BC 283, soon spread into Palestine and everywhere, disseminating among the Jews a taste for metaphysical subtleties and mysteries. Again, he says, under Ptolemies, the Jews began to learn Egyptian and Oriental theology and to incorporate those foreign dogmas in with their ancient creed. And once more, he says, quote, some among them were so unfaithful to their country and their God as to court the favor of the conqueror, Antiochus Epiphanes, by mixing pagan tenets and superstitions with their own sacred doctrines and ceremonies. In these extracts, we have some very important facts in aid of our inquiry. The pagan philosophy gradually crept into Jewish schools, and the Jews incorporated into their ancient faith the dogmas of both the philosophical and theology of Egypt, the very fountainhead from which came the doctrine of future endless torment. Let's highlight that. Okay, but not only did they borrow from the Egyptian, but also from the Oriental and Pythagorean philosophy, in both of which, as well as in the Egyptian, one of the distinguishing features was the doctrine of metempsychosis, or the transmigration of souls as the method of retribution after death. Indeed, Pythagoras made so much of this dogma that it was often called, especially by his name. And it was almost universally believed by the Oriental nations, and is to this day, especially by the Hindus, the Burmans, and followers of the Grand Lama, by the Buddhists generally. As this particular doctrine has an important bearing on our inquiry, it may be well to enlarge a little on this point. The opinions of the Egyptians have already been stated. Pythagoras taught that souls were sent into bodies corresponding to their several characters. The good were allowed to inhabit those of a gentle and social kind, as bees and doves and ants. The bad were sent into such as resembled them in disposition and life, the angry and malicious into serpents, and ravenous in robbing into wolves, the fraudulent into foxes, and with the incivility of Mahometan, cowards and effeminate, into the bodies of women. The Buddhists, according to Judson, believe that mankind passed into other bodies, the character of which is determined by their conduct in the present life. They may be sent into the bodies of birds, beasts, fish, or insects from a higher or lower grade. If wicked, they will reach hell or the place of unmixed torment. In case of atrocious crime, as the murder of a parent or a priest, they pass through no transmigration but go directly to hell. Woo, getting Christian here. Reference number 5. It will be seen, corresponds with what Wilkinson says of the Egyptian doctrine, that only those sinners whose crimes admit of purification are allowed the benefit of this purgatorial transmission, where the unpardonable sinner is condemned to endless fire. The Hindus have brought the doctrine to such a degree of perfection that they profess to be able to tell precisely the sin which the person committed in another body by the affliction which he endures in this. For instance, they say the headache is a punishment for having, in a former state, spoken irreverently to father or mother. Madness or insanity is a punishment for having been disobedient to parents or to the priest or spiritual guide. Epilepsy is the penalty for having in another body administered poison to anyone at the command of a master. Pain in the eyes is retributive for having, when in a former body, coveted another man's wife. Blindness is a punishment for having killed one's mother. But this person, before coming into another body, will be subjected to many years of torment in hell. Man, isn't this awful? Such are the views, respectively, of the Egyptians, Pythagoreans, and Orientals on the subject of transmigration as a system of retribution beyond death. And from these sources, Infield and others say the Jews borrowed, largely incorporated the dogmas, both of their philosophy and theology, with the sacred doctrines of their ancient creed. Is there any proof that they borrowed the particular doctrine in question? We answer there is abundant proof, which we will proceed to offer. Of course, in doing this, we shall not distinguish between the particular Egyptian and the particular Grecian elements. Indeed, they were so blended after the conquest of Egypt by Alexander and the influx of Greeks into the country that it would be next to impossible to separate their two influentials on the Jewish mind and opinions. In presenting the evidence, we shall do with the Jews as we did with the heathen. Let them speak for themselves. In the apocryphal Book of Wisdom, written perhaps from 50 to 90 years before Christ by an Egyptian Jew, we have the following. I was a witty child and had a good spirit. Yea, rather being good, I came into a body undefiled. Chapter 19 and 20. Josephus, who wrote about 150 years later, says of the Pharisee, quote, they believe that souls have an immortal vigor in them, and that under the earth, Sheol or Hades, there will be rewards and punishments, according as they have lived virtuously or viciously in this life. Later, they are to be detained in an everlasting prison, but the former shall have the power to revive and live again. This, it will be seen, is a great advance on the Old Testament Sheol or underworld. And we find nothing of that sort among the patriarchs or prophets. Again, he says, the souls of the pure and obedient obtain a most holy place in heaven, from whence the revolution of the ages, they are again sent into pure bodies, while the souls of those committing suicide are received into the darkest places in Hades. Once more, all souls are incorruptible, but the souls of good men only are removed into other bodies, but the souls of bad men are subject to, you guessed it, eternal punishment. These testimonies are sufficient to show how thoroughly the doctrine of transmigration had fixed itself into the Jewish creed by the time of Christ. It will be seen that the extracts indicate that transmigration or permission to enter other bodies on earth was regarded by the Pharisees and Jews as a reward of virtue and goodness, while the privilege was denied to the wicked who were kept in the underworld or Hades, subject to punishment. It is probable that the silent inactive and gloomy character of Sheol, or the underworld, of the early Hebrews, which we have already described, see chapter 2, section 5, may have given this form to the doctrine among the Jews and caused them to regard deliverance from it to the cheerful life of the earth a favor and a reward. It certainly was a common opinion with many that as far back as the second book of Maccabees, perhaps 150 before Christ, that the wicked would be punished by being deprived of a resurrection or confined to in the underworld as shadowy ghosts without action or enjoyment. This, I think, is the first glimpse we have of a future punishment among the Jews coming, as we see, not in the form of torment, but as a refusal of privilege of a resurrection. The doctrine has prevailed extensively by the Jews. David Kimchi, AD 240, says, quote, "The benefit of the rain is common to the just and the unjust, but the resurrection of the dead is the peculiar privilege of those who have lived righteously." Moses Gerundisson says no one can be partaker of an interest in the world to come, but the souls only of just men, which separated from their bodies, shall enter into it. Manasseh ben Israel, in a treatise on the resurrection of the dead, says, quote, "From the mind and opinion of all the ancients, we conclude that there will not be a general resurrection of the dead, and one common to all men." Pocock has brought a large mass of evidence from rabbinical writers to prove this point. Item number 8. Let's see. We're almost done, I think, with this section. I'll wind it up there, and I'll put the link in so you can come in when I shut up, and we can have fellowship, okay, around the things we have just learned. There's the link. I don't know if I pinned it to the top. I don't remember. Anyway, the assertion, oh, you know what? I could do that right now. Just for beauty and convenience. You like beauty? You like convenience? Check out that link pinned to the top. The assertion of Ben Israel that this was the mind and opinion of the ancients is probably too broad for the facts, but it shows that at a very early period, this notion had taken place in the Jewish belief. The second book of Maccabees, written 250 years after Malachi, shows that it was held at that point. Still, this is not the universal opinion, for evidently, transmigration in the time of Christ was regarded by some as a method of punishment. Hence, in the account of the blind man restored to his sight by Jesus, we have this question: "Master, who did sin, this man or his parents, that he was born blind?" And that's in John 9. "Master, who did sin, this man or his parents, that he was born blind?" This shows plainly that the people thought that the man might have been sent into a blind body as punishment for some sin in a pre-existent state, which is an exact copy of the Egyptian and Oriental doctrine. In Luke 15:16, verse 14, we have another trace of the doctrine among the people. In answer to the question of Jesus, "Whom do men say that I, the Son of Man, am?" the disciples say, "Some they say that thou art John the Baptist, some say Elias, others say Jeremiah or one of the prophets." They seem to think that the soul of some of these ancient Greek men of God had returned again to earth in the body of Jesus, which to them was satisfactory explanation of the miracles he wrought. Many of the Jewish doctors have believed that the souls of Adam, Abraham, and others have at different times animated the bodies of the great men of their nation. It is not easy to see how those alluded to by the disciples could believe that John the Baptist, who had so recently been put to death, could have entered the body of Jesus, who was 30 years old. But then the ideas of the common people on this subject, as well as of the learned, were very much mixed and confused, and moreover, there was every variety of opinion respecting the moral theory of the system. The Egyptians believed in transmigration as a punishment of vice. The Pharisees believed it as a reward of virtue. And the Pythagoreans believed it in both as a reward and a punishment. The Egyptians excluded the extremely wicked, and the Pharisees excluded the wicked generally, who were punished in the underworld, while Pythagoras excluded the extremely good and pure and philosophical souls who were sent directly to heaven or the society of the gods. So great was the diversity of opinion in regards even to leading features of the system. Philo, an Egyptian Jew contemporary with the Savior, believed the air to be full of spirits who from time to time descended to unite to themselves with mortal bodies, being desirous to live in them again. And Josephus reports the Essenes, one of the three chief sects among the Jews, as holding the same views in regard to the preexistence of spirits, which is, in fact, equivalent to transmigration. Well, a sufficient number of witnesses has now been cited to prove that the Jews borrowed from the pagans the doctrine of transmigration, with all its accompaniments of future retribution and endless punishment. And they abundantly justified the statement of Infield that, quote, the purity of divine doctrine was corrupted among the Jews in Egypt, who, under the guise of an allegory, admitted doctrines never dreamed of by their lawgiver and prophets, and adopted a mystical interpretation of the law, which converted its plain meaning into 1,000 idle fantasies. But other views of punishment after death were entertained, approaching nearer to the crude notions exhibited in the preceding chapter. The apocryphal books called the Wisdom of Solomon, written from 50 to 70 years later than the Second Maccabees, contains the doctrine of future retributions as a more positive form. The habitation of the wicked is in darkness and amid terrors, and the Almighty turns all the elements against them, thunderbolts and hailstones, tempestuous winds and the waves of the raging sea. Philo also taught that the souls of the wicked were cast down into the depths of Tartarus, into the blackest darkness and night, where they are surrounded by all kinds of ghostly shadows and fearful apparitions. Here they suffer a never-ending death, agonizing with present torture and with the terrors of evils to come, without relief and without hope. This sounds like the very echo of the classic fables and brings us to the very sanctuary of pagan belief. It is Greek with a slightly Jewish accent. But not to extend this part of the inquiry too far, I shall close with citing the authority of the learned Dr. Campbell, which states very clearly, the process and growth of the doctrine of retribution after death among the Jews, according to the Greek and Roman model, from the time of the captivity, more especially from the time of the subjection of the Jews, first to the Macedonian Empire and after to the Roman, as they had a closer intercourse with pagans, they insensibly imbibed many of their sentiments, particularly on those points where their law was silent. Item number 10. And wherein by consequence they considered themselves as at greater freedom. On the subject of a future state, we find a considerable difference in the popular opinions of the Jews in our Savior's time from those which prevailed in the days of the ancient prophets. As both Greeks and Romans had adopted the notion that ghosts of the departed were susceptible to both the enjoyment and suffering, they were led to suppose that a sort of retribution in that state for their merit or demerit in the present. The Jews did not adopt the pagans' fables on this subject, nor did they express themselves entirely in the same manner, but the general train of thinking in both came pretty much to coincide. Perhaps they did not adopt the pagan fables in every particular, but they appropriated the basis, and the framework of them, and invented others of their own equally gross and absurd. Leclerc says, quote, they borrowed so great a number of fables that their history after the time of the last sacred historians was scarcely more reasonable than most fabulous histories of paganism. And he adds that as they were better instructed than the pagans, they were therefore more blamable for having invented many falsehoods. They invented and borrowed till, as Thayer says, about the time of Christ, they had so invalidated the law by the intermixture of heathen doctrines and ceremonies borrowed from the pagans. In short, Judaism itself had become so corrupted and disguised as to be a source of national discord and division among its votaries. These facts and testimonies are enough, I trust, to satisfy the reader of the sources from which the Jews derived the doctrine of endless punishment and other false notions which they entertained respecting the future state. And after this review, with what force and directness the Savior's words return upon us. In vain they do worship me. In vain they do worship me, teaching for doctrines the commandments of men. Matthew 15, verses 6 through 9. And we see the point of his charge against the Pharisees after they rejected the divine commandments. In fact, let's highlight this. In vain they do worship me, teaching for the doctrines of men. His charge against the Pharisees, that they rejected the divine commandments, that they followed their own traditions by which they made the word of God of none effect. That's worthy of highlighting as well. Also, his warning to his disciples to beware the doctrines of the Pharisees and the Sadducees. Wow. Okay. The truth is that in the 400 years of their intercourse with the heathen, during which they were without any divine teacher or message, pagan philosophy and superstition had, so far as regarded the future state, completely pushed aside the law of Moses and the sacred scriptures of the Old Testament and set up in their place, the place of them in their own extravagant inventions and fables and respecting the invisible world. The end for now. Hang on a second while I scroll to the next chapter and grab my pointer tool. Hey there, JG.
Battle Master, what's happening?
Okay, let's see.
Did you follow? Reading?
What's that?
You done reading? You
Yeah,
convince
for
yourself
now.
that hell is not there. There's no consequence. Do what thou wilt, Anton LaVey. Do you think his philosophy was wrong?
I don't even know who he is.
Anton LaVey, he's the head of the Church of Satan, probably in the 80s.
Still, I don't know anything about him.
Well, he claimed to worship Satan.
Well, good for him, huh?
Yeah, I mean, what was he doing wrong, right?
I wouldn't know anything about him.
Okay.
So, did you hear any of the reading of this essay? Huh?
Heck no, I tune you out when you talk.
Well, you're just precious, aren't you?
Yeah, that's right.
So, what we were doing all day long today on 3 different programs, this is part 3, we were reading an essay written in 1855, just before the Civil War got on the way. And it was revised and updated, and then revised and updated again. And the final version came out in 1871. It was written, published in 1871. A complete history of the origins, the pagan origins of the Christian hell. And it's pretty good, pretty well researched and pretty thoughtful. And I'm totally impressed.
Well, that's all that matters.
I'm also not just impressed with his theology or philosophy or whatever. I'm impressed with his grammar.
Oh, good.
Because the grammar from the 1800s was really far superior to what we have today, ever since government schools shoved American education into a tailspin.
Yeah, the Prussian education system has weaved its way. The dumbing down of America.
Right. Yeah, and I would recommend anybody read this essay just for the grammar, the lessons in grammar that you get out of it. And by the way, if JG, you want to read the essay, just the link is in the show notes below.
No, we need a little hell in our lives. I don't want to be unconvinced of hell.
Really?
Yeah, I mean, we just see consequence all around us, don't we? I mean, when we search for truths, like what has happened to the education system, Operation Paperclip, are you familiar with it? Yeah, when we look at those things, history, and find that there's all sorts of things that have happened that most people don't know about or care about, when we find the truth of the matter, I don't really find it to be good news, personally. I find if you want to say there's a goodness there, it's in finding what is true, what is real. But how I feel about what I find, it's not typically a good feeling. You get the same result when you search history, sort of YouTube has pretty much banned a lot of stuff, but I don't know if you were searching prior to 2013 and uncovering things. You've probably been doing it longer than I have, actually, but
probably have.
The internet's been most helpful. But when you found truths about history, different government operations, different things like the air we breathe, what's in the food, what's in the water, fluoridation, the vaccines. When you found out that stuff, did you say it was good news?
No, I didn't.
Right, but you thought it was true news, right?
Well, it's not news; it's old material.
Generally speaking, what I'm saying is, when you're running on a frequency and then you read something to the contrary, like you're doing with hell, with other things, vaccines, chemtrails, GMOs, fluoridated water in the works, when you start to find those things out, you're glad that you found out what is true, you could say, but it's typically not good news. Wouldn't you agree?
And your point is?
Point is in my search for what is true, I'm typically never happy about what I find. It just is. Really? It is what it is. And I'm trying to.
I have some
common ground.
Some really good news for you.
I'm trying to find like a common ground where you understand what I'm saying, because I think that you do. Because you've researched these things. We've had
I've seen plenty of the dark side of humanity, and I'm the only one I know of who goes out of his way to say that Abraham Lincoln was the very worst president we've ever had, and I can prove it mathematically. You just add up the dead bodies. He was not a great statesman. He was a dictator. But even beyond that, so I can say that humanity doesn't have a great track record at all. It looks like bad news if you're just looking through the lens of humanity itself. But if you look at the cross of Christ, oh my God, JG, there is some great news there. That's where everything comes together and everything makes sense.
Yeah.
And so I am totally thrilled with God's grand operation from beginning to end, all because of the cross. It will be the song of the entire universe, even beyond the eons, to sing of the glories of what God accomplished in Christ's cross. Every knee will bow and every tongue will not shut up about the matter. There's a ing form in the word confess. Every knee will bow and every tongue will confess. There's an ing form in that verb. They will be confessing, acclaiming that Jesus is Lord. There's no hint of it stopping. They'll be totally excited once we see the really good news of what God has done.
It really depends on the interpretation, because there's obviously different takes on that. That when a confession isn't necessarily mean that you're excited and boasting and celebrating. It just means you've come to the end where you no longer can deny it. You have to confess what is true. It doesn't necessarily mean it's a happy ending. I think that you're kind of
let me bring you up to speed on the matter.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, we've got we are all familiar with the dark side of humanity, right?
Well, there's a dark side and there's a light side. There's a contrast there, right? Obviously.
We are all familiar with the dark side of humanity. It's not a big thing that we could brag about. It's just full of corruption, sin, condemnation, pain, and death, and blood. Miles high, dead bodies, okay?
When you know about that stuff, though, doesn't it help you in order to act when you see it coming, when you see it making its way insidiously into the school system, into our lives?
I can finish my own story here. Okay, so we're all familiar with the dead bodies that man can stack up, right? And the blood and the horror and the lies and the corruption. Okay, and we would call this humanity, all right? Now, Paul comes along with a different conversation, and he says this is the old humanity. And he gives us a new thing that God is doing. God raised Christ from the dead, and he calls this the new humanity. Now we've got something to talk about. We could talk about the old humanity, and we can't shut up about the old humanity, it seems.
Yeah, you think that what you're talking about is the right way to go, but you don't want to say that because it gets in the way of the fact that you
the old humanity,
you move it over to it's mature and immature. It's mature to talk about Paul the way I do, and it's immature for the James gang to talk about the Bible the way they do. I know the game, Ace. I get it.
I don't think you know it at all. You only know enough to piss me off and try and aggravate the snot out of me, okay? And it sometimes works, but sometimes I give you a...
Hey, it's gonna aggravate you to talk to somebody who's been talking to you for a while. And
tell me then, Jack, about the new humanity. Let's talk about the new humanity. I'm bored with the old humanity. I've seen the blood.
This is what you do.
I've seen the destruction. Tell me about the new humanity. And
in other words, it's the tell yourself the story you want to hear game. I know there's all.
What do you got? Are you always going to talk about the old fucking humanity?
I'm talking about you.
Blood up to the neck. Is that all you've got? You've got nothing about the new humanity that came out of the grave?
Ace, this is not.
I'm not going to put up with this shit, JG. The new humanity is what we need to talk about and understand and rejoice in. All you've got is dismal, dark bullshit of dead bodies everywhere.
Ladies and gentlemen, we ought to talk about what Ace wants to talk about because he said.
Bite me, bite me. Brothers and sisters, we are, you can come in right now if you wish. But we've been going over today 3 different times on 3 different occasions. Brother Thomas Thayer's book called, affectionately, I call it affectionately, The Pagan Origins of the Christian Hell. And let's see, let me bring it up again, and I'll give you the exact title that he gave it. It was very similar, but different. The origin and history of the doctrine of endless punishment. And he doesn't hold back, so I call it The Pagan Origins of the Christian Hell. In his title, he doesn't immediately start in on the pagan heathen idea of it, but he does get around to it. And that he shows with great detail that the Jews in the Old Testament did not have an idea about endless punishment in hell. They had a temporal punishment on earth. Stewart says this is a major mistake later. Okay. So sorry that you've made a mistake. Doing the best we can with the tools we have there, Stewart. And so anyway, Brother Thayer traces out that that in the Old Testament you can't find any threat of endless hell. The only threat seems to be of punishment in this life leading to death. And then when the Jews became acquainted with Egyptians, when they were moved in with the Egyptians, and when they became intermingled with the Greeks and the Romans, they started borrowing Greek mythology, Roman mythology, and Egyptian mythology. And so by the time Jesus shows up, and Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John shows up, the Pharisees are pretty well acclimated to the idea of endless conscious punishment. But it's still not a thing in the Old Testament. And anyway, so we've got some interesting things to talk about, boys and girls. I would recommend that you grab a copy of the book over on tentmaker.org and read it for yourself. And hit the StreamYard link and come on in right about now. I was just entertaining a Mr. JG, and he wants nothing to do with God's accomplishments in Christ's cross. Best I can get out of him is he wants to talk about man's dismal state. Man's dismal, dark state. Yeah. And I guess he infers that man must be punished eternally in hell because of man's dismal state. But he's got no idea that God has his own program going. And in the resurrection of Christ, we can see a great shift in God's grand program. We have gone from the old humanity to the new humanity. And Christ was roused from among the dead as the first fruit of them that repose. What a grand promise that is. Thank you for stopping by and giving me a thumbs up. I will put the after show link in, and I'll close up shop. And tomorrow we'll pick up where we left off. And maybe we can even finish this essay tomorrow. Grace to you, and bye for now.